Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating piece of source material. And honestly, it takes us on a pretty wild ride. We're going to start by looking at a very specific, localized regional planning issue in South Korea, but we're going to scale it all the way up to this grand philosophical vision for the nation's global destiny. It's a deep dive into the structural changes heading our way, and the timeline? Well, it's actually much closer than you might think.
In fact, the lecture we're analyzing today kicks off with this incredibly bold quote. The era of making things to sell and eat is over. The era of labor is ending. I mean, wow, it completely challenges our traditional view of the daily grind. The speaker is essentially arguing that working purely for survival, clocking in just to manufacture goods or earn a paycheck to buy food, is rapidly becoming obsolete. So to really understand this massive shift, here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll hit the 2026 inflection point. Second, the Busan-Ulsan-Gyeongnam megacity integration. Third, the transition from laborers to researchers. Fourth, we'll look at why the world is focusing on Korea. And finally, we'll unpack the mission of Hongik Ideology.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, 2026, the massive inflection point.
What's really striking here is that the source doesn't just throw out vague predictions. It points to a very specific year, 2026, as a critical window, a hard boundary where these major structural shifts absolutely have to begin. The idea is that we are moving out of an era of provincial autonomy, where local governments just try to survive on their own, and hitting this 2026 inflection point. If society can navigate this pivot successfully, it leads right into the post-2030 global era, which is going to demand entirely new ways of living and organizing our cities.
Which brings us right to Section 2, the Busan-Ulsan-Gyeongnam megacity integration.
So, how do we actually survive this 2026 inflection point? While the source proposes a very targeted, local solution within South Korea, taking Busan, Ulsan, and Gyeongnam and completely integrating them into one unified megacity. The text paints a really stark contrast here. On one hand, you have the traditional provincial system, isolated, selfishly competitive, and basically an outdated survival model that's destined to collapse. On the other hand, you have the megacity system. By teaming up, these regions pool their resources, creating a unified energy mass large enough to actually collaborate on a global scale. It's literally adapt or fail.
Now, within this newly integrated system, Busan gets a very specific upgrade. The lecture envisions Busan transforming into a world-class maritime cultural city. We're no longer just talking about shipping containers and industrial output. We're talking about building an elevated cultural infrastructure to prepare for a massive global wave that the speaker insists is coming.
Okay, moving to Section 3, from laborers to researchers. To make a megacity like this actually work, the people living in it have to evolve too. And this is where the text pivots into a fascinating shift in how we view work itself. It presents a super sharp, almost provocative binary. You've got the old mindset of the laborer, which the source literally compares to modern slavery, working purely for physical survival and a paycheck. And then you have the required future mindset, the researcher. This is someone who views their job not as a chore, but as an intellectual and cultural contribution designed to push society forward.
And to back this up, the speaker drops a fascinating historical point. 5,000. For 5,000 years of human history, only a tiny elite had access to real knowledge. Everyone else was essentially stuck doing manual labor. But today, in the post-World War II era, we've educated a massive, universal population. Having all this knowledge across the board is a totally unique situation, and with it comes a totally unique responsibility.
So we should probably clarify what the lecture actually means by a researcher, right? Because we're not talking about scientists in white lab coats mixing chemicals here. In this context, a researcher is any highly educated person, whether you're working in a factory, an office, or running your own small business, who actively transitions away from just basic physical labor. Instead, you elevate what you do, focusing on cultural, educational, or welfare work that actively benefits the people around you.
And the clock is ticking because of technology. The speaker issues a pretty dire warning. As robots and automation inevitably take over all those physical manufacturing tasks, clinging to a laborer mindset is going to lead to rapid societal decline. If we don't adopt this researcher mentality, we're simply not going to survive the highly automated future that's practically already here.
Let's look at the bigger picture in Section 4. The world focuses on Korea.
So why does this internal shift, integrating cities and turning laborers into researchers, why does that actually matter to the rest of the world? Well, the lecture points to a really fascinating demographic stat.
The global interest in Korea right now isn't being driven by corporate businessmen. Actually, 70% of people globally learning the Korean language are women, youth, and children. Only 30% are adult men. This perfectly illustrates that this massive global focus is rooted in cultural curiosity and soft power, heavily driven by the Hallyu wave.
And because of that intense cultural curiosity, the source makes a bold prediction. By the year 2030, we're going to see a massive physical influx of global citizens seeking out Korea. The world isn't just going to want to buy Korean smartphones or cars anymore. They're going to flock there looking for cultural and intellectual leadership. Which leads us to a really profound question raised right in the lecture. When all these people from around the world finally arrive in Korea, drawn by this cultural magnetism, what exactly are they going to be looking for? What ideology or set of values are they hoping to learn and take back home?
And that perfectly sets up Section 5, the global mission of Hongik Ideology.
This is where all the local planning and societal shifts we've talked about finally culminate. The answer to that question is Hongik Ideology, which is defined as the foundational ideology of broadly benefiting humanity. The speaker argues that this specific spirit is Korea's ultimate protective force. It's supposedly the reason the nation wasn't swallowed up by larger empires over thousands of years. And now, it's meant to be Korea's ultimate global export. The end goal isn't just getting rich as a nation, it's exporting a mindset that actively helps humanity.
The lecture breaks this down into a really clear three-step evolution. Step 1 was the corporate growth phase, where South Korea rapidly built up its economy and accumulated resources. But according to the source, that phase is totally over. We are now in Step 2, the business phase. This is where the true purpose of business is to use those accumulated resources to broadly benefit people. And if you do that successfully, it naturally evolves into Step 3, global leadership, where this new model actually guides humanity forward.
So the golden rule of this new era is remarkably simple, yet it's radically different from how things currently work. The speaker emphasizes that right actions, actions that benefit society, will naturally lead to prosperity. Conversely, selfish actions, like just hoarding wealth for yourself or your own region, will inherently lead to hardship. The main takeaway? Focus on your purpose to society, and the money and survival part will naturally take care of itself.
Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought to wrap up today's explainer. When you look at the integration of cities, the explosion of automation, and the end of traditional labor, it all points to a massive paradigm shift. So as the era of labor ends, are you ready to shift your own mindset, elevate your role, and become a researcher working for the benefit of humanity? It's a wildly fascinating way to look at the future, and definitely something to chew on. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.